People learned about my homecoming. Various people would come to see me. I was a young man. Before I had become ill, I had been very ruddy and handsome, but my face did not have a worldly beauty. It was a godly beauty. And now that I was back in the world, everyone was commenting about me and about my hair. I hadn't cut my hair from the day that I left for the Holy Mountain. My hair had grown and now reached below my waist. There was a great fuss in the village about this, so in order not to cut it, I boiled a pot of water, put my hair in, and left it to boil for quite some time. The hair was damaged and fell out. I was almost bald. So, as I said, people would come to see me in the village. It was put about there that my father's son, myself, who had disappeared and had been dead, had returned from the mountain where he had been a hermit. People came to see me out of curiosity. I said nothing. I felt acutely embarrassed. I went to the church in the village. Everyone poked fun at me. My mother was ashamed. She wept and bewailed her fate. The poor woman couldn't bear to set eyes on me. She didn't want me and forced me to leave the house. To begin with, my aunt took me in. There I started to have good food, milk, cheese, eggs, and meat, to recover from my illness. But I couldn't stay there for long because I wanted, a different environment. What was I to do in the house? Moreover, I was embarrassed because I had nothing for my family. How could I now ask them to look after me? At a 4 or 5 hour walk from the village, there was a monastery dedicated to St. Charlambos. One day I asked my father to take me there, now with a view to staying. I hadn't the slightest idea what I would find there or whether they would want me. In the meantime, we happened to meet Father Yanis. He telephoned the bishop. At that time, there was a telephone line, and told him that a monk from the Holy Mountain had arrived. The bishop said to him, "Keep a hold on him, Father Yanis. Don't let him leave us." The bishop, Pantaleimon Faustinis, had a great affection for monks. My father took me, and we set off. I went to kiss my mother's hand, but she pulled her hand away and wouldn't give it to me. My father then took me to the monastery of St. Charlambos. The abbot gave me a warm welcome. He liked me and spoke to me. When I told him of my difficulties, he said, "Stay here. We have eggs and milk, chickens, and everything." And so I stayed there. The abbot was so fond of me that he cooked special food for me. To begin with, I didn't have any appetite for food, but gradually I recovered. My father also stayed with me initially to look after me. My father was a cantor and had the good fortune to have been acquainted with St. Nectarius. My father had a deep faith and was very devout. When I felt better, I went straight back to the Holy Mountain. My elders were overjoyed, but after 10 or 12 days, I suffered a relapse. I lost my appetite, I grew pale, lost weight, and became exhausted with a diet of vermicelli soup and such like. I had, you see, become seriously ill. Once again, I obtained permission to leave and set off for the monastery of St. Charlambos. There I was back to eggs, cheese, butter, and so on, just as before. Once again, I recovered and gained strength. After 3 months, I returned once more to the Holy Mountain. 3 times I went and returned, but each time, after 10 or 12 days, I suffered a relapse. The 3rd time, my elder said to me, "We have a responsibility for your health. We can't keep you. We love you and we want you, but God is showing that you must leave so that you don't die." Indeed, they added, "We love you, and if ever God grants you the possibility and you wish to come here, then please do. We want you." And they sent me away. They said to me, "We're afraid the other monks will blame us if you were to die here. You're such a young lad. We don't like at all having to send you away, but we have no other choice. You see that we have exhausted what our love can offer. You've gone away and returned 3 times, and you haven't been able to make progress here. They gave me a blanket for the journey, which I have kept, and it is my best blanket. It's the one I had in my cell. I made my prostrations on it, I slept on it, I wrapped myself in it when I was standing to take a nap upright. That is, I slept awake. On that blanket, I did all my spiritual exercises, and so I left the holy mountain for good. I went to St. Charalambos. All the people there wanted me. They were fond of me and were pleased that I had returned. Once again, I went back to the rich diet of milk, butter, and eggs. Let me tell you something important that I remember. There was a monk on the holy mountain who was called Father Joachim, and he lived in the hermitage of St. Nilus. The monks who are in obedience to him are still alive. Now, he wrote a letter to my mother, and he lambasted her severely, very severely. He wrote that even the wild beasts loved their children. He wrote a lot, fine things certainly, but very pointed and very harsh. And so my mother was really crushed. Later, however, she changed. She devoted herself to the church. When I was celebrating the liturgy, she would sit opposite me. She would cross her arms and pray. She was always looking at me. She didn't take her eyes off me at all. "My priest," she would say proudly. In the nearby village where I stayed for a short time after my ordination, they used to call her Papadia, the priest's wife, even though she was my mother. They would kiss her hand and she would glow with pride. I was with her when she died. "I should have made all my children monks," she used to say to me. I took it all very badly to begin with. I wish now that all my children had become monks. At the monastery of St. Charalambos, I lived as a monk with the same tactics as before. I loved reading the lives of saints, the poetic canons, and so on. I learned passages of the New Testament and prayers by heart. I had known the Psalter by heart for years. I knew all the Psalms. I was able to combine the different passages. The Psalter was the food of my thought. As I said, I lived in the monastery as a monk, a little monk with an old, worn-out cassock, and I continued to go out at night and recite the Psalter because they didn't read it during the services in the monastery. I helped with the chores in the monastery. I was always on the move. They had given me the keys to the cheese-making workshop in the monastery because there were 2 or 3 elderly monks who needed help. All the dear monks there placed great trust in me. But while I was engaged in all the chores, I didn't let my mind wander. I kept a strict control on it. Or rather, I didn't keep a strict control on it. It's just that my thoughts were on my love. It's like a girl who, let's say, falls ill with pleurisy, yet her mind remains fixed unswervingly on her lover. You understand? The loved one, devotion to the lover, to Christ. I became a priest in the monastery there. Listen, and I'll tell you the story. The bishop was always at pains to support and lavish care on students and teachers of theology. At the time, there was a final year theology student who had gone to stay in the bishop's accommodation while he was studying for his degree exams. Now, it was the bishop's habit to get a discussion going with all the monks on some spiritual topic, during or after their meal in the refectory. Let me give you an example. The bishop would say, "Tell me, which is the greatest virtue?" And then the monks would offer their opinions. There would be about 15 around the table. The topics were various, about scripture, religion, monasticism. One evening, when the discussion happened to center around monasticism, the bishop sighed heavily and said, "Ah, find me monks. There's nothing else I want. Good, faithful, and patient monks. Nothing else." Just that. Then I can do wonders. At that point, the theology student jumped up and said to him, "Dearest Bishop, You're crying out for monks, and yet there's a monk up at St. Charalambos who's pining away, and you don't even know him." "Really?" exclaimed the bishop. "Yes, there's a poor young lad who's come from the holy mountain. He's very good, but he's very weak, skin and bone, and the abbot has him doing chores. Well, then, you'll go down there at once and bring him here to me." So he came down with a letter addressed to the abbot asking for Nicetas. That was what I was called then. It was my monastic name. I went at once to see the bishop, and when I met him, he put his hand on my head and said, "How are you, my boy?" We went and sat together, and he started asking me, "Where are you from? How did you get to be here?" And I told him in as few words as I could how much I loved Christ and the ascetic life, and how I had gone to the holy mountain as a boy. I explained to him how I had fallen sick and how my elders had sent me out into the world to recover. Well, what happened then? He summoned for me the best doctor, who came and examined me and gave me a whole load of medicines. The bishop wanted me to stay there, but I was embarrassed to stay with the bishop. What I wanted was the forest, silence, and simplicity. So I returned to St. Charalambos. The bishop visited the monastery regularly. The dear old man was very saintly. I recognized his saintliness with my charisma. One day he had come to St. Charalambos, and I heard him speaking, and I liked very much what he said. I had never heard someone preaching a sermon in my life. The bishop had established a charitable foundation, which he called the Holy Order of St. Pantaleon, and occasionally he would visit the monastery along with the children belonging to the order. On another occasion, the bishop came to the monastery along with the Archbishop of Sinai, Porphyrios III. It was then they made up their minds to make me a priest. As you will understand, I didn't want to become a priest. I had learned that the right thing to do was to seek to remain as a monk and not to strive to become a priest or a bishop, and that when people start telling you to be ordained, you leave. That's what I knew. In the end, however, Porphyrios III made me a priest and gave me his name. I had fired him with enthusiasm. When we were taking a walk in the hills together, I revealed something personal about him with my charisma, and he said to the bishop, "Make sure you don't lose him." At the time, I was only 20 years old. I didn't want to become a priest, but I couldn't avoid it. The bishop insisted so much, and the bishop is in the type of Christ. You can't continuously repudiate your bishop. You can't damage your relationship with your bishop. Otherwise, your prayers don't rise to heaven. They remain fruitless. And so they made me a deacon on the feast of St. Paraskevi and a priest the day after on the feast of St. Pantaleon. After 2 years, they made me a confessor. On a great feast day, when there were lots of people present, they took me to the bishop's residence, and they officially read the prayer for becoming a spiritual father. I was very young. What did I know about it? And a foolish wretch, I was thick-headed into the bargain. I was still uneducated. I didn't know the penitential canons, and with incredible stupidity, what did I do? I bowed my head in obedience. Now I realize my folly. At the time, I wasn't so aware of it. How the monks and lay people that came for confession loved me. I heard confession there day and night, non-stop. I started early in the morning, and I continued all through the day and throughout the night, and the next day and the next night. Without interruption, I went 48 hours without eating. Fortunately, God took care of me and gave my sister the inspiration to bring me food, some milk to drink. There was a stairway with lots of steps leading up to the confessional, and the people would come up to make confession. They waited all night long for their turn. When they left, they would say to each other, "Now there's a priest who's a knower of hearts." I remember they used the Albanian word for priest, priftis. I stayed there for 15 years. When they would come, I used to ask questions. I would ask, "How old are you? Whom do you live with?" One would say, "With my wife," another would say, "With my parents," and another, "I live on my own." Then I would continue. "What have you studied? What's your job? How long is it since you made confession? How long is it since you received Holy Communion?" And so on. And then, depending on what he said to me, I would speak to him a little, and because there was a queue waiting outside, I would say, "What do you remember now, my child? What do you feel is weighing on your soul, on your conscience? What transgressions have you committed? What sins?" And the person would gradually begin to confess errors, and I would help them along, having told them first that they truly must say everything, just as they feel it. To begin with, when I first started to hear confession, I used to really scald those who came to make confession. I used to have at my side St. Nicodemus's Confessor's Guide when someone would come for confession. If a person confessed a serious sin, then I would look up the book and would see that it wrote, "Not to receive Holy Communion for 18 years. Oh, I didn't know. I was inexperienced, and so I imposed the corresponding penance. Whatever the book said was law. But then the people would come back the following year. They would come from various places, from various villages, from far and near, and when I asked them, "How long is it since you made confession?" they would answer, "I confessed to you this time last year." Then I would ask, "And what did I tell you?" They would reply, "You told me to do 100 prostrations every night. And did you do them?" "No." "Why not?" "Well, you told me that I couldn't receive communion for 18 years, so I thought to myself, since I'm damned anyway, I might as well forget about the whole thing." You understand? Then another person would come and say the same thing, so I thought, what do I do now? It was then I began to become a little wiser. The confessor has the power to bind and to loose. I remembered one of St. Basil's rules, and I took that as my basic guideline and changed my tactics about confession altogether. The rule says, "He who receives the power to bind and to loose, when he sees the great remorse of one of the sinners, let him reduce the time of the penance." Don't let him judge the penance in terms of time, but in terms of disposition. And so I started to encourage the people to read the poetic canons written in honor of the saints, to read short prayers, to make prostrations, and to read Holy Scripture. And in that way, they began to pay attention to the things of our religion. Their hearts were softened, and without any external prompting, they desired to observe the fasts, to enter the spiritual arena, and to come back to Christ. And one thing I have understood is that when someone comes to know Christ and love him and is loved by Christ, everything thereafter proceeds well in holiness and joy, and everything is easy. I remember many incidents from my life at the monastery at St. Charalambos. Let me tell you about one. I've said before that I love the forest. I had become accustomed to solitude, and I wanted to be on my own. I wanted to live out of doors, especially at night. So I climbed up into an evergreen tree, more than 2.5 meters above the ground, and I made myself a bed there out of the stems from a shrub. I put the stems and interwove them with the branches, and I laid a blanket on top, wrapped myself in it. It was wonderful. I would climb a ladder that I had made, and once I was up, I would pull up the ladder, and no one would bother me. I had surrounded the bed with a wild clematis, and its plentiful blossoms produced a delightful fragrance. Beneath the evergreen tree, there was a thick shrub. It grew 2 or 3 meters from the roots of the oak. I would scramble up onto the bed. Once there, I was all prayer. I was a monk of the holy mountain. What I desired was solitude and the Psalter and the prayer, the Jesus prayer. I would pray for hours up on the tree, surrounded by the flowers of the clematis and lying on my shrub bed. One evening, when I had clambered up into this flowery bed, I started to say my prayers. It was nighttime, and in the midst of the wilds, the moon washed creation in its light. The nightingales, which had just woken up and had started to sing, accompanied me. I recited numerous verses from the Psalter, and most of all, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. At one point, I stood upright and silently recited the office of Compline. When I began to say the prayer to the Theotokos, I brought before my mind an image of our all-holy Lady. The most holy Theotokos, on a glorious, divine, and elevated throne, and round about the order of angels and archangels, the cherubim and seraphim, the martyrs, the saints, the holy fathers, the prophets, they were all there for me. Before this magnificent vision, I knelt down as unworthy and began to say aloud, spotless, undefiled, incorrupt, immaculate, pure Virgin, bride of God and Lady. Awe and trembling had seized me when a ray of light emanating from the Holy Lady fell on my head, which I had bowed low in humility because of my unworthiness. As soon as I had finished the prayer of the Theotokos and fell silent, I heard a sound beneath the tree and saw a man emerge. He said to me, "Man of God, come down, I want to speak to you." I climbed down, and he greeted me and said, "I'm very hungry." "I'll go and fetch you something," I said. "Listen, and I'll tell you," he said. "I've come from America, and I've killed my wife. They were hunting for me, and I fled into the hills to avoid being arrested, but I'm dying of hunger." I went and brought him 3 prospera. He explained to me that his wife had a lover, and that when he heard about it, he came back and did what he had done. He had repented, but nevertheless he had done it. "I beg you, man of God, don't tell anyone about me," he implored, and disappeared into the darkness. When morning came, the police arrived looking for him. They asked me if I had seen anyone, and they described him to me. "No," I replied, "I saw nothing." What that man confessed to me happened through the grace of Our Lady. What I tell you is true. The most holy Theotokos was there before me and sent her shining ray of light on me, a humble young monk, albeit a priest, about 21 years old at this point. For a time, I was appointed priest in a village in Evia. I'll tell you about one of the many incidents that took place there. One day, a woman riding on the back of a donkey came towards the church where I was serving. As soon as she saw me, she dismounted and came up to me and said, "Papuli, my boy is sick. What's the matter? He's lost his voice." "Has he been like this for long?" I asked. "Yes, he doesn't speak at all." The boy was about 18 years old. I took my priest's stole and went down with her into the village. I arrived at her home. I saw the boy, who was quite genuinely not speaking. I said to her, "Come, and let's do a blessing of water." She pulled across a chair and set a bowl of water and a towel next to it. I started to read the service. The boy stood dumbly by. I finished the blessing and started to sprinkle the water around, singing, "Save your people, O Lord." When I then touched the boy on the forehead with the cross and the spray of basil, he said to me, "Thank you very much." Thereafter, that boy became very fond of me. Somewhat later, he became godfather to a little boy, and he gave the child the name Porphyrios. Afterwards, he came and said to me, "I've given your name to a little boy." "Did you ask?" I retorted. "I love you," he said, "and I wanted to give him your name." Listen to another similar story. This is also in Evia. Once a woman came to me with her daughter. The daughter was dumb. The mother said, "Papuli, I'm very worried about my daughter. She hasn't spoken for a month." "What happened?" I asked her. "We had tied a goat up down by the stream, There were lots of brambles there, and my daughter went down to fetch the goat. It was night time, and when she came back, she was dumb. I went and did a blessing of water for her. The mother, in fact, was the wife of a priest. I asked her, "Which priest is your husband?" "This priest." "Oh, are you Father Christos's wife?" "Yes, Papuli." So I read the blessing, and the priest's daughter recovered, through the grace of God, of course. After years had passed, and while I was still in Avia, I wanted to find a new place to collect my thoughts, like a hunting bird that wants to fly to God's embrace through prayer of the heart. I was alone and desolate. I went to Vethea in Avia, to the monastery of St. Nicholas, and I stayed there for 10 days. It had some tumble-down cells full of large mice. But what happened? For 2 days there was a great storm and heavy seas. It rained unceasingly, and the rain hammered on the walls and rattled against the windows as if it were hail. The wind howled furiously up in the huge plane tree. I heard its branches hitting against one another. The storm raged relentlessly there in the utter wilderness. All the elements of nature were roaring, and I was inside the poor tiny fresco-covered church of St. Nicholas, a church sanctified many times over years before by the souls which I saw and sensed were bending down before the saints and unlocking their hearts. There in the wilderness, in the cold north wind, I was like a hunted little bird of the air. Imagine what would a little bird caught in such a storm have done? Wouldn't it have sought to find a little nest, some cave to hide in? I did the same amidst the uproar and the storm, terrified by the elements of nature. I ran to find refuge. I ran to hide myself in the embrace of my Heavenly Father. I sensed the pleasant warmth of Christ, my union with God. I felt great joy and exaltation and relief hiding myself away in God. I was unconcerned about the storm and the tempest, which are things of the world. My soul sought something higher, more perfect. I felt safe, comforted, and at rest. I spent golden days there. I took advantage of a spell of dreadful weather. That's how we should always think, and that's how we should live through difficulties and tragedies. We should see them all as opportunities for prayer, for approaching God. That's the secret. How the man of God will transform everything into prayer. That's what St. Paul the Apostle means when he says, "I rejoice in my sufferings, in all the tribulations he encountered." This is how sanctification takes place. May God grant this to us. I ask for this fervently in my prayer. I stayed for a considerable time, 3 whole years, in Vethea, in the monastery of St. Nicholas. I left just before the Italian invasion of Greece in 1940.